Sometimes people mistake obsession for love. They think about you constantly. They want to know where you are, what you are doing, who you're speaking to. And at first, this kind of attention can seem very flattering. But what happens when that obsession goes way too far? Hi, I'm Chika, and this is What If I Told You? Love stories that make you think, make you question people, and sometimes leave you wondering how could somebody actually do this? Then you're in the right place. Jodi claimed she loved Travis, but in June 2008, Travis was found dead in his home in Mesa, Arizona. And what if I told you the same person who claimed to love him would eventually be accused of taking his life? Let's get into it. So this story starts with Jodi. At the time, Jodi is 27 years old. Living in California, she worked different jobs while trying to establish herself. She was a waitress and she also had an interest in photography. And in June 2006, while attending a conference in Las Vegas, she meets 30-year-old Alexander Travis. Alexander is a successful salesman and motivational speaker living in Mesa, Arizona. He was deeply involved in the Mormon faith and he hoped to eventually get married, settle down, have kids, and start a family. When Jodi and Travis met, it was an instant connection. They began talking, and before long, they were communicating every day. The relationship developed quickly and seemed very easy and natural, at least in the beginning. Jodi eventually converted into Travis's faith, and her connection with Travis grew deeper. Travis also played a very important role in her introduction into the faith, and he ultimately baptized her. So at the point, everything seemed to be falling into place. Just two people who had met quickly and quickly became involved in each other's lives, but neither of them could have known just how significant the meeting in Las Vegas would eventually become. Because what began as a seemingly effortless relationship would slowly become something much more complicated. And at first, the warning signs were easy to overlook. At first, it was the little things. A text Travis didn't answer quick enough, or a joke that didn't land the way Jodi expected it should, plans he would make without telling her, things that in other relationships might have been brushed off with a simple conversation or a simple apology. But between Jodi and Travis, things always didn't end there. A missed call could lead to a series of arguments, a delayed response, a full-blown argument, and the more these things happened, the more it seemed Jodi wanted to know what Travis was doing, where he was, who he was spending time with. And at first, it could have looked like an ordinary curiosity, right? But slowly, that curiosity began to feel so much different. The questions became more frequent: where he had been, who he had been talking to, why he hadn't answered, why he had made plans without telling her. And when the answers weren't what Jodi wanted to hear, tension would follow. These arguments became a pattern. Jodi could be jealous over the people Travis spoke to, the places he went to, and even the things that she believed he might be thinking. And that was the frightening part. Sometimes it wasn't always about what Travis had actually done, but rather it was about what Jodi believed that he might have done, what she thought he might be thinking, and what she imagined could be happening when she wasn't there. That's the crazy part, because how do you defend yourself against something that exists only in another person's mind? That kind of tension can slowly change a relationship. So what once felt like attention can begin to feel like monitoring, and what felt like affection can begin to look like possession. And what just starts with wanting to know everything about someone you truly love can eventually become wanting to control everything around them. But despite the arguments, this relationship didn't simply end. Instead, they seemed to fall into a cycle. They would argue, feelings would get hurt, one of them might threaten to leave, and then somehow they would find their way back to each other. Anger would turn into apologies, distance would turn into closeness, fight would be followed by another reconciliation, and for a moment everything could feel normal again until something happened and then they were back where they started. It was almost as if neither of them could completely let go, even when the relationship was clearly becoming much more difficult. And that made everything more complicated because this wasn't a relationship that went from happy to unhappy overnight. It was a gradual shift. The signs were there. The boundaries became blurred, the arguments became more intense, the emotions became harder to separate from the relationship itself. And eventually, breaking up didn't seem like necessarily walking away to both of them. So even after their relationship changed, Travis and Jodi continued to remain involved in each other's lives in ways that made their clean separation much more difficult. And this is where the story becomes even more complicated. Because when two people who have already decided that a relationship isn't working, but they continue pulling back to each other, the line between attachment, jealousy, and control becomes very difficult to see. What had once seemed exciting and intense was beginning to take on a very different meaning, and slowly, what had once felt like love was beginning to look more and more like obsession. But neither Jody or Travis could have known just how dark the relationship was about to become, because the arguments, the jealousy, the inability to let go was only just the beginning. By 2008, Jody and Travis had been involved with each other for about 2 years, and their relationship had already become much more complicated. There had been affection, there had been arguments, there had been jealousy, tension, and the relationship neither of them seemed to be able to walk away from completely. Then came June 4th, 2008. Judy went to Travis's home in Mesa, Arizona, and at first, there was nothing about the evening that suggested it would be any different from the others, just two people who already knew each other, spending time together behind closed doors. But sometime that night, something went terribly wrong. What exactly happened inside the house remains one of the most disturbing questions surrounding this case. What investigators would later uncover was so horrifying. Travis had been attacked, he was stabbed repeatedly 27 times. He was also shot and his throat had been cut. Whatever had happened inside the house had led Travis dead. The murder of that night wasn't discovered immediately. Days would pass before anyone found Travis's body. And when he was finally discovered on June night, the scene inside the home raised far more questions than answers. Who had done this? Why would anyone want Travis dead? And how had someone been able to enter his home, carry out such a brutal attack, and leave immediately without being identified? These were the questions the investigators had to answer. So the detectives began with the people closest to Travis. They looked at his recent interactions, the people he had been spending time with, his relationships, and anyone who might have had a reason to want to hurt him. So they began speaking with his friends, his acquaintances, trying to understand what Travis's life had looked like days and weeks before his death. Because in a murder investigation, investigators don't just ask who knew the victim. Rather, they ask who had a motive, who had the access, and who had an opportunity. The detectives started putting together the pieces of Travis's life. They began hearing about the complicated relationship he shared with a particular woman. And before long, one name kept on coming up: Jodi Arias. Hearing the name wasn't enough. Investigators needed more evidence. And the evidence they began uncovering would make Jodi more difficult to ignore in this case. There was a forensic evidence connecting her to the crime scene. Investigators had recovered a camera that contained photographs taken around the time of Travis's death, including images from inside his home. So piece by piece, the investigation began to focus more heavily on Jodi. And then on July 15th, 2008, police arrested her in California. So when investigators confronted Jodi, she initially denied having anything to do with Travis's death, but that wouldn't be the end of her story. So in the months that followed, Jodi would give investigators several different versions of what had happened that night. So at one point, she claimed she had not killed Travis at all. So then came another story. She claimed masked intruders had broken into their home and killed Travis while she escaped. Eventually, however, Jodi acknowledged that she had killed Travis, but she maintained that she had acted in self-defense. So according to her account, Travis had attacked her and she had fought back because she believed she was in danger. The problem for the prosecution was that the physical evidence and the circumstances surrounding Travis's death raised serious questions about that explanation given. And those questions would eventually become the center of one of the most closely watched murder trials in the United States. So in 2013, Jodi Arias went on trial for Travis's, Alexander's murder, and Prosecution argued the killing was not an act of self-defense but a deliberate murder. The defense, however, presented a very different picture, maintaining that Jodi had acted out of fear for her own life. For weeks, the jury heard evidence about their relationship, the events leading to Travis's death, the physical evidence recovered from the scene, and the different story Jodi had given the investigators. And after all the evidence had been presented, the jury reached its decision. So on May 8, 2013, Jodi Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder, and the case wasn't completely over just yet. Her sentencing became another major chapter in the story, and in 2015, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And that leaves us with a very difficult question. After everything that happened between Jodi and Travis, was that punishment enough? Was justice truly served, or do you believe the sentence should have been a little bit different? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe, because sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. So until next time, stay curious. One love.